Thank you very much. And can we start with Elliot Colburn, who I think is the only member who sits on both the Women and Equalities and Petitions Committee?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses as well. Alana, if I can turn first to you and ask a similar question as we heard in the last panel about the national curriculum and the government's response to the petition, which has got us all together this afternoon to have this conversation. Particularly when they say that the national curriculum already gives schools the flexibility essentially to teach whatever it is that they want when it comes to this, and they have the topics and resources that they need to do so. Would you agree that that is the case, or do you think there needs to be more mandated elements of the curriculum in order to achieve that?
There is some flexibility within the national curriculum where schools can choose whether or not they'd like to include diversity and inclusion. But I think the main issue and the disappointing part of this from the DfE is that they're allowing diversity and inclusion to become an ad hoc extension of education as opposed to an integral part that is intertwined into all parts of education. And in doing so, they're allowing our students, who we are growing for a global society, to come away with an education experience that either makes them disenfranchised or belittles them or doesn't give them a fair and rounded view of society, and therefore in doing that doesn't allow the DfE or the curriculum or what we're doing in schools to fulfill our ultimate purpose, which is to grow the best global citizens that we can. So yes, we can do it ad hoc. It's left up to which schools decide that they want to, but that certainly isn't good enough for an institution that is meant to be guiding our future citizens.
Thank you. Emily, I can see you nodding throughout that. Do you have anything that you wanted to add to what Alana's just said?
Yeah, I do tend to nod a lot. I do agree with Alana totally. I think, yeah, that's what we're hearing a lot from the DfE is there's freedom at both, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, 3 upwards. And yet I think that's just too much of an excuse not to really put the work into resourcing, into teacher training, into really making sure that these options where these topics can be explored. They do exist, these topics at GCSE, etc. But I think without them being really promoted and there being kind of a real push for that, just saying there's freedom for this to happen, I don't think it goes far enough.
Thanks, Emily. Christine, would you agree with Emily and Alana there?
Yes, I think there is flexibility in the curriculum, but ultimately it's a matter of choice and what teachers and schools feel comfortable delivering, what's within their frame of kind of knowledge and experience. And I think obviously you're going to go with what you're familiar with and what you're happy teaching, and you can do it well.
Good, thank you. And finally, Caroline, did you want to add anything on to what the others have said?
Thank you. Yes, I would just like to add that actually academies are legally exempt from following the national curriculum, and we now have a majority of secondary schools that are academies and a growing number of primary schools. So actually just looking at the national curriculum in isolation is potentially a limiting approach that's unlikely to affect real change. I think there are other factors: inspection and accountability, school budgets, procurement and CPD, and training. I think are key factors that actually would probably put together effect a larger change than just focusing on the national curriculum itself as well.
Thank you all. Again, picking up on one of the themes from the last panel, one of the themes that came up was about resourcing. Again, to all of our panellists, really, do you think that schools and teachers have the clarity that they need about what resources might be appropriate or even available for them to use, especially in light of some of the recent debates that we've had about impartiality? If I perhaps go in the same order, if Alana, I could start with you again.
So when it comes to resourcing, there is a plethora of resources available, and that has been made available mostly by grassroots organisations and by research entities. And there are high quality resources that are available. However, the priority for these resources go with the priorities that are dictated by the DfE, priorities that are dictated by examination boards, and the priorities that are dictated for schools that happens within their monitoring. It is disappointing to hear some of the language that is coming out of the DfE that demonstrates that there is no sound understanding of equity, diversity and inclusion. So in terms of the provision of resources, what they have done to an extent is create a fair culture where teachers are now not confident enough in the resources that they're using, in the sources that they're going to for resources in order for them to teach this as a part of the ongoing curriculum. Now, in no part of teacher training, whether head teacher, early career framework, initial teacher training, ongoing training, at no point is there a focus on how do we teach equity, diversity, and inclusion for our current society, and how do we entwine it into our curriculum. It's never been a focus. It doesn't come out from exam boards. It doesn't come out from the DFE. It certainly does not come out from Ofsted in any part of their monitoring. So therefore, when we're asking teachers to now go and look for these resources for themselves, because it's a part that they can do, ask them to go and look for, to teach those resources to students on their own accord, without any training, without any benefit, and especially if it doesn't become a priority of the school or the academy trust, or even the independent school system that they're working within, then that is an incredibly huge ask. So the inaction comes from the fear of getting it wrong.
Thanks, Alana. I do want to come back to teacher training in a bit, but on the question of resources, again, if I can, Emily, turn to you next.
Sure, thank you. I agree with what Alana was saying. I think that coming from looking specifically at migration teaching resources, we've done quite a lot of work on that, as you can imagine, and we have a resource bank on our website where we signpost, very time-pushed teachers to some of the resources from our partner organisations or other people that have put together, or teachers who've put together great resources, because there's a lot out there, a plethora, as Alana says, and some of it's great and some of it's really not great. And actually, I think it's important that we help streamline and signpost teachers. I just really want to use this opportunity in terms of talking about great resources, though, to promote our migration story, which is the amazing piece of scholarship, the website put together by Runnymede with academics from across the UK in line with teachers' needs. It's a great resource, and it was a pleasure to be on the advisory committee for that. And I think it just shows, though, that an amazing thing can be put together like that, thousands of hours of work on lots of people's part, but unless the dissemination plan is there as well, it's really hard in our fragmented education landscape to work out how best to disseminate a resource like that. And that's probably something that Caroline has much more experience of than me. But thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Christine, can I turn to you on that same question about resourcing?
Yes, I mean, I've been around long enough to remember Multiverse, which existed prior to 2010, which was a resource that was focused around issues of diversity, inclusion, equality, race. It was there for teacher educators, for trainee teachers, and also for practicing teachers. So we have a history of having a resource. That resource was put together, was kind of monitored really by people in teacher education who reviewed all the resources that were submitted. And it was I was on the editorial board of that, and it was very, very thorough. So we do have history of having a portal for that kind of resourcing, but I think, as the other speakers have said, it's all rather fragmented at the moment, and we actually need something that's more central, perhaps along the lines that Marla mentioned earlier, some kind of organisation which would have a brief for these kinds of things.
Thank you, Christine. And finally, Caroline, if I can turn to you to also talk about this issue of resourcing.
Thank you. There are really good quality resources out there, whether they're made by curriculum publishers, whether they're made by charitable organisations and expert organisations and museums and so on. So there are resources out there. I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that regardless of whether the resources are there or not, actually it's the challenge schools face in being able to obtain them. And when we look at the budgets available for resources in schools, we carry out a lot of research and surveys on schools annually. And our annual report in January of this year, with responses from nearly 1,000 schools, showed that typically a primary school will have just over £1 million as its budget. Of that 1.1 million budget, they would typically spend £4,326 on books, printed resources and digital content. So that's 0.4% of their budget, which if you take that on a per pupil basis, that's just £10.30 for every pupil on books, printed resources each year. And for secondary schools, it's £17 per pupil. And when you look at the challenges of what that's got to cover all curriculum subjects, not just history, geography, and the topics we might be talking about today, that makes it a large challenge. And then you add to that the issues of this year with COVID and the LSE report we saw earlier in the year, which actually says that schools are going to need an additional £1,350 per pupil per month to make up on the potential lost learning. It makes it an almost insurmountable challenge for schools to be able to provide pupils with the resources they would like to.
Thanks, Caroline. I want to come on to teacher training and budgets in a second, but Caroline, if I can just turn specifically to you on this next point and ask if any of your members have raised specific concerns about impartiality, as we heard in the last panel about impartiality, particularly when it comes to the teaching of critical race theory, for example. Have any of your members expressed a view to you as an organisation?
They haven't come to me with that view or that particular question. What they have been more focused on actually is, I think in a really responsible way, actually looking at what they're doing as their own organisations and looking at the diversity within their own catalogues and printed resources. And I think they're keen to address that issue and look at what we can do as an industry to influence positively with our kind of curriculum resources.
Thank you, Caroline. If I can move on to teacher training now, I think all of you have kind of answered this already, but perhaps we can go into a bit more detail about whether or not the initial teacher training actually encourages teachers to reflect critically on how content is taught and whether or not that makes them feel confident in using diverse teaching practices and resources to engage all types of learners from diverse backgrounds. And perhaps if I stick with the order we've been going in and start with Alana again.
So from what we can see in the teacher training standards, as well as through initial teacher training, there isn't much opportunity put forward for diversity and inclusion to be a large part of the teacher training unless it is already embedded part of the culture of the school. And we know very well that across the vast majority of our schools, it's not a well embedded part of the culture. So teachers are being allowed to focus, and I think even within the new early career framework, the focus is on manage the behavior, know the subject content, get to know the school culture, but there isn't any specific focus that says, if you are from a different culture, how are you going to use the cultural contribution that your students, that the other teachers around you have, and how is that going to be embedded into the curriculum that you're teaching and the things that you will choose and select to teach and the manner in which you will select to teach it. Similarly, when we look around recruitment for students for initial teacher training, there is no real evidence that there has been any change in the level of bias that's being demonstrated in the students that are being selected for teacher training. So we still have that stereotypical idea of what a teacher looks like. And once we put those barriers into getting diverse teachers into the population or into the career in the first place, and then add further barriers of those who are in the career, allowing them and their colleagues to be able to teach around diversity, equity, and inclusion effectively, it just makes for a system that is going to struggle to change.
Thanks, Alana. Emily, if I can move on to you on that question of the initial teacher training.
Sure, I think probably I'll keep my answer brief because I'm not a specialist on this area, but I think we find at the museum, like I said, we've worked with thousands of pupils and their teachers, and really the teachers who often come to us for workshops and for exhibition tours, etc., because they cite a lack of confidence in dealing with these potentially quite tense issues around migration, identity, racism, diversity, etc. And so we create that safe space for them. But you have to imagine that those are teachers who come to us who are self-aware about that lack of confidence, who have the capacity to organise trips and to get stuff done. And so, there's thousands of teachers that we're not seeing. And I suppose that is that lack of confidence that I'm aware of at a wider basis is, what I'm kind of interested to do more for, I suppose, as a museum. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. Christine, can I bring you in on that same question?
Yes, I do think there are some as someone who kind of works in teacher education, I do think there are some difficulties with the ITT curriculum, actually, because there isn't space really for ITT providers to truly embed a conversation about race, diversity, equality, inclusion in their curricula. Typically in a university-based course, you might have one session for the year with some vague notion that, it's embedded through everything else. But that's very difficult to track and monitor. And I've been working quite hard at my institution to challenge my colleagues to think about how these conversations can be threaded through and how actually we can make the connections for the students so that they know that, okay, there's one key lecture that you're having on diversity, equality and inclusion also has connections with the session that we're doing on planning for learning, with the session that we're doing on assessment, so that they can see the connections more clearly. But I do think there are some fundamental difficulties that teacher education does have at the moment in relation to this.
I was going to ask Christine about whether there was anything missing from the initial teacher training curriculum, and would you say that actually the first and foremost it is the space that's as you say, or is there more than just creating the space? There's actually things that need to be threaded throughout the teacher training curriculum to make teachers feel more confident discussing about race and diversity in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, earlier on, Martin, he's going to murder me, Marlon referred to the teacher standards. And actually, over time, what we have seen is that having gone from a very explicit focus on issues to do with diversity and inclusion, where there were specific teacher standards that refer to that, we have gone to a set of teacher standards that don't even mention the word diversity or inclusion. And that's problematic, to kind of say to teacher educators who have a finite amount of time with their students, because 50%, in a PGC, for instance, 50% of the program is delivered in school, to ask them to do this very broad-based work that is really important to help our beginner teachers kind of understand what these issues are, how it relates to them and their reality, and then how they're going to use that, as Alana says, in terms of the children that they're working with. So to me, it's an issue of time, but it's also about content. I think we need to go back to having an explicit focus, or more, at least something that talks to these issues. We can't continue in the way we are by having this kind of dialogue which says that there's flexibility, it's in the curriculum. It's not.
Thanks, Christine. And Caroline, can I bring you in on teacher training as well?
Thank you. It's not an area of expertise for BESA, but particularly initial teacher training. But in the surveys that we put out to schools on ongoing continuous professional development, it's always an area of general CPD, let alone issues of diversity, inclusion, and specific CPD. Almost 40% of primary teachers say they need additional support in understanding at the moment, particularly how to use educational technology. So there'll be multiple levels of need in relation to their ongoing training that would need addressing in school as well as ITT training.
Thank you, Caroline. And I think picking up on the discussion we were having earlier about budgets and the impact that the pandemic in particular would have had on school resourcing. We've talked about the curriculum, we've talked about training, but how much do you think budget plays a role in the decision on the importance or the level of importance that is placed on teaching diversity within the curriculum within individual schools? Again, perhaps if I could use the same order and start with Alana.
Budgets play a significant role in schools because what you can budget for and what you can invest in, you can prioritize. And when it becomes, throughout the pandemic, the priority in my school and in every school across the country has been, how do I keep students safe? How do I keep the environment safe so that they're able to attend? How do I staff it so that they're able to learn? And staff remote provision as well as making all of those provisions. Not having that funded and then having to make another outlay and think, right, how am I going to deal with my students' mental health? How am I going to ensure that they are all very well cared for? And then still having to put the curriculum together means that I'm going to try to do something on the cheap. And when you start doing equity, diversity, inclusion on the cheap, as we know, we've seen happen with our SEN students and the outcomes that they're able to have when they're not invested in. It's the same thing that's going to happen in our schools across the country. So unless that investment is there and ready to be made, and we know that investment, when something is prioritized and the investment is made, the impact is much larger. So unless we're ready to make that investment, yes, budgets are going to play a significant role in limiting how much schools can do and how fast we can elevate equity across our schools.
Thanks, Alana. And Emily, does the museum have any insight onto the impact of budgets on the teaching of diversity in the curriculum?
I would say that this is not an area that's so much.
No, not.
So I'll pass on to Christine, who definitely will have more to say about it.
Fantastic, Christine. If I can bring you in on budgets.
Yes, I can talk about this in relation to my role as a teacher educator, and this is one of the things we've been concerned about in terms of how we support our trainees, and we've had to think very creatively and very carefully about how we can support them within the current context that they're training in, but also to make sure that we maintain those very high standards that we have of them in terms of their understanding of these issues. And I think we've been very creative, we've used technology quite a lot, but I would say, yes, funding is quite a significant factor here.
Thanks, Christine. And Caroline, finally, if BISA has any kind of insight into the effect on budgets on the teaching of diversity in the curriculum.
Absolutely. Well, like I say, we do an annual report on expenditure in schools, and in our 2020 report, the head teachers who responded said that fewer than 22% of primary schools and 16% of secondary schools felt that they were adequately funded for their teaching and learning resources supplies. Now, that was before the pandemic. We've obviously had additional pressures, as we've heard from other panellists, on schools, particularly with supplying PPE, keeping their staff safe. When we survey our schools, we do ask them what of the budgets they're planning to spend it on, and we are seeing a reduction in the amount that schools are planning to spend on resources. Again, I will caveat this was in January. We haven't updated it post school closures, but what they were expecting to spend less on resources because they were investing their spending focus more towards teachers and teaching assistants. Now, even though I represent an organisation for supplies of resources, I'm not going to challenge that at all. Of course, you need a talented, able, high quality teacher, but it does show where pressures are in schools, that they're having to fund the teaching and teaching assistants, and that's leading, they can't do both, that's leading to a reduction in resources. There is a small, given this particular context, I think, ray of sunshine. Again, this was in January, but of the amount they were going to spend on resources, that through Key Stage 1 through to Key Stage 4, more schools said they were expecting to move their resource budget to prioritise humanities over other subjects, and that's a new trend. We haven't seen that over a number of years, so that's a small positive. However, that's likely to have changed given the additional pressures of this year.
Thank you, Caroline. So we've touched on the curriculum, we've touched on training, and we've touched on finance. And if I can just finish very quickly on a fourth element, which is teachers' working hours, and the effect essentially of a teacher's workload on whether or not diversity and conversations about race will play a role in their continued professional development as they go through their careers as a teacher. Again, if I could go through the same order, Alana, do you feel that the time pressures that a teacher is under is another pillar, another column of why potentially there isn't more discussions about this within the classroom? Oh, sorry, Alana, you're on mute.
Yes, definitely, because teachers whatever teachers do, we want to do it very well, and we want to make sure that it's high impact for our students. And depending on a teacher's starting point of understanding diversity and inclusion, not having had it through their training, or as a core part of their training, it means that the amount of learning that they have to do in order to deliver diversity and inclusion in the classroom really well, or be able to access resources or even find out about resources, that is going to impact very much on their workload. Now, most organizations do try to highlight and put it directly in front of teachers in a really simplistic manner so that they're able to access it quickly, because high quality, accessible resources would be what the teacher who has a high workload would be aiming towards in the first instance, until they have enough time to build up their own knowledge and understanding. But that definitely has to be one of the measures that's taken if we really want to push this agenda forward as a starting point, considering the current workload that teachers have been under.
Thanks, Alana. Emily, if I can turn to you, and if you have any insight into how working time might have an impact here.
Yeah, I mean, in our experience of the teachers I work with through the museum, but also of many good friends who are teachers, I mean, they're exhausted, absolutely exhausted. And I guess from the museum perspective, we've kind of pivoted our education program. Given that we're close to the public right now, we're not accepting school visits until probably springtime. We really get the chance to focus much more on teacher training, feeding into PGCE programs, but also multi-academy trust teacher training programs and CPD. I delivered a session yesterday. I'm delivering one tomorrow. And I think just keeping them, as Alana says, like as practical as possible, just understanding that teachers' time is incredibly precious. And so I'm going to spend that hour and a half really giving things that they can adapt very quickly to fit their classroom. And I guess that's the bit that we can do to acknowledge what teachers are up against and try and make their lives a bit easier. But yeah, that feeds into really our whole teacher training kind of approach.
Thanks, Emily. Christine, can I bring you in on this question of teachers' time pressures?
Yes, for me, I think it's a case of not thinking about issues around diversity and inclusion and equality in terms of, a teacher has to have this thing and to deliver it. To me, it's more a journey. And I see my role as a teacher educator of helping teachers to begin to understand some of these very big ideas and big concepts. And for me, that's something that needs to be built into their continuing professional development. And it's something that, in the same way that we want to make sure that we plan high quality learning for children, we want to make sure that we also have high quality understanding and practice around issues to do with diversity, equality and inclusion. So for me, it's more about how do we think about these issues as part of a teacher's progression. It's not something that's going to be bolted on as it has been, because it doesn't work very well. So I think we need to kind of consider how can we begin a conversation around some of these issues in a teacher's very early experiences. How can that be continued once they're in the class and they're moving on? And how can we embed that as a core aspect of teachers' practice?
Thanks, Christine. And Caroline, if I can bring you in to also give us a view on working hours.
Yeah, I think going back to that previous point about if there aren't the resources available to buy in or use or know where to go to find resources, many teachers will spend extra hours creating their own, putting them together, and that can add significantly to their workload burden. That was something that several years ago we identified as a challenge, and actually have tried to develop an online portal where teachers can go to for advice from other teachers on effective resources that they could use in their classes, and also to give them the chance to try them free of charge, because we also find that because schools are time pressured, they may make the wrong purchasing decision for the resources from their school, which ends up with wasting money and things not being used and adding more time and pressures. So we've actually set up a kind of a try before you buy service for teachers to learn from other teachers about what might work in their context, which will hopefully help cut down on some of the time it would take them to find them.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, witnesses. That's all the questions from me.